Hello everyone. I'm Sumaya Hassan, a researcher in Gulf Institute for Democracy and Human Rights. You are welcome in our second session in the online conference holding by the Gulf Institute supporting detained human rights defenders in the Gulf states. This session, which comes in conjunction with the International Day in support of torture victims. We will talk about prisoners of conscience in the Emirates under the title Prisoners of Conscience in the Gulf Screaming Silently. I will start my speech by talking about Arab detainees in Emirates prisons to shed light on their conditions and the violation they are exposed to. The Emirati authorities have not only arrested and tortured their Emirati citizens on the background of charges related to freedom of opinion and expression, but have also gone beyond the practice of arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance of Arab residents on their lands due to accusations related to freedom of expression as well. Dozens of detainees of different Arab nationalities are imprisoned in the Emirates prisons, and the security authorities against them practice different types of systematic torture just as they do with their citizens. First, we have to talk about Lebanese detainees in Emirates prisons. This issue is divided into two parts. Section 1, Emirati authorities has arrested 3 Lebanese in 2015 due to trumped-up charges and political backgrounds. One of the 3 detainees, through a leaked audio recording, revealed the brutal torture he was subjected to. However, the United Arab Emirates judicial authorities did not investigate these allegations and sentenced the 3 Lebanese men to prison based on their confessions extract under torture, in addition to preventing at least one of them from seeking advice or legal aid. The second section dates back to the period between December 2017 and February 2018, when it was announced that 8 Lebanese men were arrested over charges similar to those that were fabricated for the first group. 7 of the detainees were working for Emirati Airlines, and by virtue of their work, they owned brochures on aviation and planes, but the UAE authorities considered them as evidence of their involvement in monitoring the airport, gathering information, and preparing to hijack planes. Their conditions of detention were not better than those of their predecessors, and international human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, have documented the brutal torture of detainees. According to the statements of their relatives, they were placed in solitary confinement for long periods, and 3 of them were held in secret detention facilities for about 3 months, and they were prevented from communicating with their families, obtaining legal assistance or advice, or even viewing the evidence presented against them. The security forces forced some of them to sign documents while they were blindfolded, while one said that he was forced to sign a white paper. Relatives of the detainees had reported prior to the trial that UAE authorities only allowed detainees to make short calls, and guards ended the call if they touched the conditions of their detention. A relative of the detainee said after the first 20-minute visit, "All my relative's teeth were broken and his ear looked deformed, and he told me that was a result of the breathing on the face." Others reported being subjected to mental intimidation. Violations were not limited to this. Some lawyers who were appointed by the families of the detainees stated that the UAE state security protection forced them to sign a pledge not to provide the families of the accused with any file of the case or evidence against them. And others said that he was not allowed to see the files of the case, while none of the lawyers was allowed to meet the accused. On May 10, 2019, 5 of the detainees in the second section of the case were released and the other 3 in the same case were sentenced to prison after unfair trials marred by many violations. The 6 Lebanese men are still being held behind bars in the Emirates at the same time in which the authorities deny the existence of political detainees in their cells, while the documented facts tell other stories. Second, we have to talk about Jordanian detainees in Emirates. In 2015, the UAE authorities arrested 4 Jordanian citizens over a message they circulated among them on WhatsApp and sentenced them to 10 years in prison. So, the UAE authorities are involved in spying on citizens and residents, violating their privacy and fabricating charges against them. According to Jordanian activists, one of the prisoners lost his entire teeth from the severity of weakness, and another could not stand on his feet for more than 5 minutes. They also reported that at least 2 of the detainees were subjected to arbitrary detention without showing an arrest warrant and subjected them to enforced disappearance for approximately 3 months, during which they were subjected to various types of torture and forced to sign confessions under torture. Third, virus COVID-19 invaded UAE prisons. We received trusted information from Al-Wathba prison about the spread of coronavirus inside the prison. The source confirmed the infection of at least 400 people, including 55 women and 37 prison guards. A family of one of the detainees informed us of the deteriorating conditions in prisons and the infection of all 6 Lebanese detainees with the virus. The UAE authorities did not provide them with any kind of health care or medicines during the period of their infection, nor did they provide them or other detainees with any personal protective gears, nor sterilized the prison or implemented social distancing, which is not possible in these small cells. In addition, the detainees were deprived of visiting medical clinic for 3 months and deprived of medicines, even those prescribed for chronic diseases. The source also reported that Arabic political detainees were also deprived on going to the canteen to buy their needs for 2 months. It should be noted that the available toilets are in poor conditions and lack hygiene. The denial of adequate medical care has been one of the methods of torture used in Emirati prisons against political prisoners and prisoners of conscience for years. The case of the detainee Ali Abd al-Noor is a good example of the abuse and brutality with which these detainees are faced. Alia, despite her suffering from cancer and its late stage, and her deteriorating health condition and medical reports, but she remained in detention in a cell that lacked ventilation and sunlight until she was transferred to the hospital. All calls to her for her to be released were failed until she died shaked on her bed. So we demand the United Arab Emirates authorities to, first, release the detainees on political background immediately, urgently, and unconditionally. Compensate them for the harm and torture they suffered during their detention. Conduct an urgent and extensive investigation to identify the perpetrators of torture and violation, hold them accountable, and bring them before justice. Third, respect the standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners, the Nelson Mandela rules, and finally work to enhance the prison environment, especially during the pandemic of coronavirus COVID-19. Thank you for listening to me, and now we have the speech of David Kani, researcher of the Gulf Cooperation Council at Amnesty International, He will talk about the freedom of expression in United Arab Emirates, and Ahmed Mansour an example. The speech is yours.
Okay, so do I have sound now? Okay, good. Thank you, Samaya. So, yeah, I will first give a bit of general context about freedom of speech in the UAE, and after that, I'll turn to Ahmed Mansour's case as an example of the way free speech is not respected by the Emirates. So, the general context, of course, is that there never has been freedom of expression in the UAE throughout its history. But the situation became quite acute beginning in 2011, particularly the period 2011 through 2013, and then onwards to today. And that, of course, coincides with the onset of the Arab Spring. So the Emirates didn't witness full-scale Arab Spring protests or uprising like a lot of other countries in the region did, but they were beginning to bubble up some signs of dissent and free-thinking political speech from civil society within the UAE. So the most emblematic example of this from that time was there was a petition circulated in March 2011 that garnered the signatures of about 130 Emirati citizens, a lot of whom were pretty well-known or prominent people locally. And the petition basically called on the rulers to move the country a little more in the direction of a democracy. If you look at the language of the petition, it is extremely modest and reformist. In fact, it pretty much bends over backwards to flatter the egos of the rulers of the UAE to which it was addressed. So this is very moderate. It's not remotely revolutionary or anything. It's about as temperate as you can get in political speech, but it was enough to make the rulers of the country nervous. So the next month, April 2011, you started seeing detentions of civil society figures, including some people who had signed the petition. One of those detained at that time was Ahmed Mansour. And ultimately, he was put on trial along with 4 other people. So this is a 5-defendant trial. The charges didn't directly mention the petition, and not all of the 5 were signatories. But what the charges were based on and did state explicitly was that it was about their contribution to an online discussion forum called Hiwar, which is discussion or dialogue in Arabic. It's since been shut down, but they had posted basically just dialogue on this site discussing possible political reforms in the country and being mildly critical of the rulers. And, you know, nominally and officially, the exact charge was brought under Article 176 of the Penal Code, and it was, quote, insulting the rulers. So all 5 were convicted. The very next day, they were pardoned and released. So basically, this was a warning, and as it ended up being sort of a dress rehearsal for much larger scale repression, which was to come. And that came in 2012 and then running through 2013 in the form of quite widespread arrests in Emirati society, especially given the local context in which this kind of thing hadn't really happened on this scale, at least not in recent memory. Ultimately, they ended up arresting and rounding together into the same trial 94 defendants. Amnesty and I think also HRW and some other groups refer to this as the UAE 94 trial by shorthand. But yeah, that refers to 94 defendants all being tried at once in a single proceeding, which qualifies as a mass trial. There's really no way the adequate examination of individual facts and adequate determination of individual justice can be determined when you throw that many people together. The charges in the UAE 94 trial, the the common charge applicable to all defendants was supposed involvement in an organization with the intent or seeking to change the system of government by force. That's nominal. In reality, again, this was about their political speech, and we don't need to engage in like an elaborate search for proof about this. We know based on the UAE's own actions what it thinks about this organization. The organization they were charged with being a part of is Al-Islah, it's called, which is basically the Emirati version of the Muslim Brotherhood. Al-Islah was officially licensed to exist by the UAE state in 1974. The UAE only came into being over the period 72 through 73. So this is actually one of the first official acts of state that they took. And it was actually only the second non-governmental or civil society organization in the country that they had ever authorized to exist. And if you look at the declaration authorizing Al-Islah to begin acting in the UAE, it states explicitly that the government regarded it as an organization for the public good and saw that it had a positive role in spreading religious morals and so forth. So regardless of what you think politically of Al-Islah, whether you agree with them or not, it's quite clear that the government didn't sincerely regard this as a dangerous organization. It's simply that it amassed too much power and too much following in the country. And at the time of the Arab Spring, when there were popular stirrings towards more democracy, the state felt the need to crush this organization and its supporters. So that trial was widespread enough in the Emirati context that it uprooted almost all open dissenters in the country. It really went across the board and covered many people who had actually been quite prominent in Emirati official life. Lawyers, judges, even former members of the federal prosecution. I think not one, but actually two former heads of the Emirati Bar Association. So it was quite aggressive, quite repressive, quite intimidating, and quite effective in quashing dissent in the country. About the only person left in the country when the UAE 94 trial wound up in 2013 who was still willing to speak openly about the government's repressive actions was Ahmed Mansour. He was really the only person left standing. And he had a very key role as an interlocutor with the outside world, with the international community, with human rights groups like Amnesty International and with the UN in sharing critical information about what was happening inside the country. So fast forward to March 2017, and after several years of quite bravely continuing to attempt to do his human rights work, Ahmed Mansour was himself detained. And then we have a series of official statements by the UAE about why he was detained. And they're pretty explicit and they're pretty interesting. As soon as he was detained in March 2017, the official news agency, which is called WAM, published a story stating that Ahmed Mansour al-Shahi had been detained for, and I'm quoting here, using social media sites to publish erroneous information, rumors, and false news, to spread biased ideas that incite discord and harm national unity and social peace, and to damage the reputation and prestige of the state, and etc. Later that same month, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs then put out a statement again naming Ahmed Mansour and stating that he had been detained for, quote, spreading false and biased information on the internet. And there are a few more of these statements I could quote to you. I'll skip over it for time's sake, but at the time of his conviction, and then again at the time the conviction was upheld on appeal, statements came out in the semi-official press and in some cases in WAM, the official news agency, reiterating these charges in slightly different formulations, but basically the same. So the thing you'll notice here, the common thread here that runs like a bright red line through all of this is that the charges were for speech crimes, for speech, specifically political speech. Probably the most common tactic of repressive governments, at least in recent decades, has been to accuse people they find troublesome of terrorism. And then outsiders who are critical, the argument becomes about whether or not there's adequate proof of that. But in the UAE, they just stated openly that they were charging him with speech crimes, and that he was convicted on that basis and sentenced to 10 years in prison. And he remains in prison now under really abysmal conditions because he spoke. So that's the case of Ahmed Mansour. It's quite appalling, and it's emblematic for the Emirates, in part because the facts are so clear, in part because of his own personal bravery and how significant his role was in the context both of the Emirates domestically and his role as an interlocutor with the outside world. And really, this is only scratching the surface of how bad the situation around speech is in the Emirates. There's just law after law that, again, is just openly speech suppressive beyond articles of the penal code that I've referred to here. Take, say, this charge that was referred to against Ahmed Mansour of defaming the reputation of the state or something like that, which is incredibly extreme just in its conception philosophically. We're not talking about defaming an individual. We're not talking about incitement to violence. We're not talking about incitement to hatred. We're not even really talking about direct criticism of the state. It's just saying things that are bad for the reputation of the state. So that's codified, for instance, in a 1980 law that the UAE passed on print materials and publishing. Article 70 of that same law states, I'm quoting here, subjecting the person of the president of the state or the rulers of the Emirates to criticism is a crime. That's sentenciable by up to 2 years. That's their language, is subjecting that person to criticism. So you can spend 2 years in jail for being critical of the ruler of the country. So, this is the UAE's attitude towards speech. It's quite open. There is no free speech in the country. And, their attitude, and I'm quoting here from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs statement on Ahmed Mansour, is at the time he was detained, they were criticized by the United Nations human rights bodies for the detention. And their response was to chastise the UN and say that the UN needs to, quote, make sure it gets its information from official sources. So from the ruler's perspective, essentially the state, which means them, is sort of the divine font of all information and all truth and dictates what's true or false, which of course is totally incompatible with free speech. That's the environment in the UAE. And yeah, those are my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Devon. Thank you so much for this for your participation. And now we move to Ala As-Siddiq, a researcher at Wajha Center, to talk about the harassment of prisoners' families. Ala, the speech is yours. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thank you. So I'm Ala, a researcher in Wajha Studies Center and a member of one of the UAE detainees' families. My father, Mohammed Abdulrazak Al-Siddiq, he's one of the detainees in the well-known UAE 1904 case. Since 2011, UAE authorities began a sustained assault on freedom of expression and association, in addition to abuse at the hands of state security forces against dissidents and activists who have spoken up about human rights issues. Consequently, the most shocking abuses are arbitrary detentions, enforced disappearance, and torture. The UAE has arrested and persecuted hundreds of lawyers, judges, teachers, and activists since then, and shut down key civil society association. and the offices of foreign organizations, effectively crushing any space for dissent. Moreover, the UAE's police state not only punish those who peacefully dissent, but harass and abuses even those related to them, with their intolerance for criticism reaching comical proportion. Nevertheless, the UAE authorities, in their determination to crush dissent, have allowed their state security apparatus to use its near unchecked power to continually punish the families of activists, both detained and living abroad. Yet none of the restrictions had a clear legal basis, and none of the targeted relatives have been able to get an official government or judicial document mandating the action, nor have they been able to appeal. Whenever the family tried to dig deeper to understand why the government was denying access to a service or holding an application pending indefinitely, they would be told verbally only that the obstruction was happening at the state security level. Now, these violations and harassment are summarized in several aspects, so I will explain what we have been able to document and verify on the ground and through multiple reports monitored by human rights organizations. Also, in each case, the measures taken against relatives of dissidents appear arbitrary and unjustified, as what I mentioned before. First of all, travel bans. Travel bans are among the most common tools used to target relatives of dissidents, both detained and who's abroad. They include mothers over the age of 90, children under the age of 18, as well as cousins and other relatives through marriage. Nevertheless, in the most cases documented, family members were not notified of a travel ban and instead found out at the airport as they prepared to leave the country. The relatives were informed of the travel bans only verbally, and when some asked airport officials who issued the order, they were simply told that the order come from the state security apparatus. Because the travel bans are not court-ordered, none of those affected have had the chance to appeal or challenge the decisions. For example, one activist living abroad said that my mom is banned from travel for 2 years now because of me. Another one said that I haven't seen my siblings in 4 years. His siblings in the UAE were banned from travel in 2015. Secondly, the second harassment or violation, the UAE has used citizenship revocation as a tool to punish activists and critiques of the government. An instance in which the government has revoked a man's citizenship, the UAE's nationality law allows for subsequent revocation of the citizenship of his wife and children, while the law requires publishing the decree withdrawing citizenship in the official gazette. Neither family has managed to obtain a copy of the decree or find it in the official gazette, preventing them from challenging the decision. Anyway, in 2017, two presidential decrees removed the Interior Ministry's authority to grant the revoked citizenship, issue and renew passports and other identity papers, and control foreigners' entry and residency, and effectively transferred the authority to the state security apparatus. Consequently, the government has revoked the citizenship of 19 relatives of 2 dissidents. In addition to that, 22 family members of 3 dissidents remain unable to renew relevant identity documents. Thirdly, restrictions on employment. Actually, to get a job in the UAE, whether in public sector or private sector, and whether a citizen or resident or to get a trade license, one is required to complete a security clearance process. Most of the dissidents' families were subjected to restrictions on relatives' access to employment and business opportunities, beside the inability to acquire or keep jobs to the need for security clearance. In fact, the security clearance process for federal public service is especially strict, and that many of their family members took lower paying private sector job or to sustain themselves and their families. However, even if family members were able to get private sector jobs, the companies would fire them soon after they started, citing the state security apparatus as the reason. One of the activists who's living abroad said that my niece and nephews who recently graduated universities, they are all finding difficulty getting jobs because of the security clearance. Fourthly, the active surveillance and intermittent questioning. Over the past several years, the UAE has invested considerably in advancing its already extensive cyber surveillance capabilities, which it uses to target leading human rights activists, foreign journalists, and even world leaders. Hence, the activists believed that state security forces carried out active surveillance of them and of family members. They said that the surveillance and intermittent questioning of many of them have had serious psychological effects on family members and have led families to severely limit communication with relatives outside the country. Often the questioning is coupled with threats. One relative who remains in the UAE said, every once in a while they call my sons, they tell them not to write anything, not to speak up on social media networks. Every time they find the organizations outside are highlighting our suffering, they would threaten us with arrest, withdrawal of citizenship, firing from job, and all around constructing of our livelihood and ability to live a dignified life. Finally, the social exclusion. The detained activists' families suffered from social exclusion as a result of the state security action. This was one of the most difficult consequences of their relatives' activism. For instance, one relative of a detained activist who now lives abroad said that our cousins all cut us off because anyone who would frequent our home would be summoned and questioned and asked detailed questions about us and our lives. We were completely excluded from society. People stopped engaging with us, fearing for their own well-being. People would even refuse to marry into our family. The security forces would actually intervene and say to them, if you marry into this family, you will face problems. The society is afraid to socialize with us. So in conclusion, the UAE's police state not only punishes those who peacefully dissent, but harasses and abuses even those related to them. It's shocking that so many other countries and influential people continue to associate themselves with government that collectively punishes innocent citizens. The situation is not acceptable on the human rights level at all. All of the human rights organizations should call for stopping this harassment and violation. To elaborate further, you can read the report written by the Human Rights Watch about the harassment and violations of the UAE detainees' families in their website. Thank you.
Thank you, Ala. And now we have the speech of Hamad Al-Shamsi, a human rights activist. The speech is yours, Hamad. Mr. Hamad.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Sumaya. First of all, I would like to thank Gulf Human Rights Organization for giving me the opportunity to take part in the conference and to speak about the human rights situation in the United Arab Emirates. Today, I believe I have been given around 15 minutes or 10 minutes. I'll speak about the violations that became a normal practice in the United Arab Emirates, or violations that became legal, or in other words, legal violations. I know these words normally do not come together, legal and violations, but sometimes we need to use contradictory words to describe a situation. Before I start talking in the topic and about the violations, I would like to draw your attention to a very important point in my opinion, and that is all cases related to freedom of opinion or freedom of expression are treated as state security cases. And when we talk about state security cases, we talk about cases that has no proper due process, no detention, starting from detention without a public prosecution warrant, being kept in places nobody knows their whereabouts, incommunicado for period of times, maybe up to 1 year in some cases. And at the end, you will be tried in a state security court. And when you get a ruling from the state security court, your ability to appeal this ruling is very limited. So what I wanted to say here, that freedom of opinion in UAE is considered to be a state security. And sometimes when I talk with the friends, I tell them, if you do weapon smuggling and money laundering, you will be treated in the same way as you tweeted in a way that the government doesn't like. So tweeting, freedom of opinion, weapon smuggling, money laundering, all are treated similarly. And maybe actually when you talk about, if your case is related to weapon smuggling or money laundering, you have an advantage to get a pardon. I mean, this advantage is rarely happen if you are a prisoner of conscience. So I'm not promoting anything here, but I'm just describing the situation. And also, I would like to emphasize how the United Arab Emirates and the state security are very serious on cracking down on people having different opinion. I will give you a number, and this number from the year of 2015. In the year of 2015, the public prosecutor opened 57 state security cases. And when you go deep into these cases, you will find out that all of them, the 57 cases, actually are related to freedom of opinion or freedom of expression. These actually are documented cases. I did not make up this number. And one of the cases of the year 2015 actually related to Amina Al-Abdouli. Amina Al-Abdouli, mother of 5 children, she was detained in 2015, in November in 2015, without public prosecution warrant. Then she was kept incommunicado for 8 months until June 2016. Around 8 months, nobody actually knows her whereabouts. And then she was actually sent to the state security court, and she got a ruling of 5 years and 500,000 dirham. Her charge, actually, her crimes, her crimes was actually related to a tweet relating to a Syrian uprising. Now, let me go into the violations that I would like to highlight. The violation number 1 I would like to highlight is arbitrary detention. Arbitrary detention, in fact, has been legal in the United Arab Emirates since 2003. In 2003, there was a law issued, law number 2, related to state security, and in one of its articles, and to be specific, article number 28, gives the state security officers the authority to detain people up to 8 months, up to 60 days. 60 days can be extended for 30 days extra. So we're talking about a total of 90 days. The detention can be done without a public prosecution warrant. The only thing that they need is a permission from the state security head. 90 days, maybe the public prosecution do not know about this guy. The public prosecution do not know that there is someone being detained somewhere in the UAE for 90 days. And after the 90 days, for the formality reasons, they can get a paper from the public prosecutions just for formalities. What happened in these prisons, actually in the prisons that run by the state security, we heard a lot of testimonies from people experienced such awful experience. They talked about torture, about interrogating day and night, annoying light for 24 hours. I mean, and all of this happening to get a confession. I mean, all what they need from this kind of detention is to get a confession from the detainees. I can name a lot of examples for people actually has gone through the same process, because I know that every prisoner of conscience has to go through the same process. But I will name here Dr. Mohammed al-Riken. Dr. Mohammed al-Riken actually was detained in 16 July 2012. He was kept in such a prison. He was actually detained without a public prosecution warrant. Then he was kept in such detention for 8 months until March 2013, when he was then transferred to Al-Wathba prison. You're right, in this kind of detention is very limited. Dr. Mohammed al-Riken could not actually talk to his family, just very rarely, maybe every 3-4 weeks he can allowed to get a phone call for 2-3 minutes. The first visit actually by his family was in November 2000. In November, so after almost 4 months after his detention, and the visit was in the public prosecutor office. Mohammed al-Riken is not alone. This is not an isolated case. I mean, as I told you, every prisoner of conscience has to go through the same process. Ahmed Mansour, Dr. Nasser bin Ghaith, and you name them, all of them. This is what I wanted to say in this violation. However, in the second violation, I would like to highlight is keeping people in prison even though they have completed their sentence. Normally, if you served your sentence, you are supposed to go back home. However, this is not the case currently in the UAE. We have 19 people being still in detention in prison, even though they have completed their sentence. And is it legal? Yes, unfortunately, this is legal. They legalized this violation in 2014. The counter-terrorism law states clearly that the public prosecutor can request from the court to detain people for 6 months, and this 6 months can be extended once, twice, 3 times for infinity. I mean, there is no up limit. So, and for what reason? For the reason if the public prosecutor only suspect that this guy still holds the terrorist ideology. I do not want to go in the definition of terrorist ideology. I think we share the same background on how they define the terrorist or being a terrorist. Should the public prosecutor prove that this guy is still holding the terrorist ideology? Unfortunately not. No, what he is requesting actually is the other way around. He is requesting a word or a recording from the prisoners to convince publicly that they are sorry for what they have been doing in the time before, and just a recording so then they can be released. As I mentioned, we have around 19 people. These 19 people is the number that we have documented. I believe that this number is higher than this, but this is what these are the documented cases. And if I would like to give an example here, I will give an example of Abdullah Al-Hilu. Abdullah Al-Hilu was detained in 2014. Later on, he was sentenced for 3 years, and his sentence was expired 3 years ago. So he's staying in detention for 6 years when his sentence actually was only 3 years. If you ask me when will he be released, I have no idea. Nobody can know actually when these people should be released, because it depends on the public prosecutor opinion, or his opinion in the case. This is what I wanted to talk about the violation. Maybe to summarize what I wanted to say, that the violations actually are awful. However, what makes them even more awful, that these violations became legal. We cannot say these are an illegal act in the United Arab Emirates, and this is our real concern. Thank you for listening. I give the mic back to you, Sumaya. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ahmad. We are moved now to the speech of Hiba Zayed, researcher at Human Rights Watch, to talk about prison situations and the spread of COVID-19 inside the prisons. Sorry, but because of the time, can you not exceed your speech than 8 minutes?
Absolutely, I'll keep it short, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll get right to it. In the UAE, prisons and detention centers are institutions that have often been found to hold detainees in dismal, unhygienic conditions, overcrowding, inadequate healthcare facilities, and denial of medical care are widespread. We and other organizations have documented this and reported on it for many, many years. As COVID became a worldwide pandemic, around the world, governments have been struggling with the realities of the pandemic reaching their own prison populations. COVID-19, like any other infectious disease, poses a particularly serious risk to people who live in close proximity to each other, including prisons, jails, and immigration detention centers. Since March, human rights groups, UN experts have called repeatedly on governments to take several measures to avoid an outbreak in their prisons, most important of which is to reduce their prison populations, which will help them best protect the health of remaining prisoners for which they are responsible. Categories of such prisoners have included those with underlying health conditions, those nearing the end of their term, pre-trial detainees, which there are many of in the UAE, especially since we know that prolonged arbitrary detention is pretty systemic in the UAE, especially in state security cases. And of course, those detained unjustly for exercising their basic rights, who should not be in prison in the first place. So in the UAE, we've already said that the conditions are ideal for the virus to spread like wildfire. And the UAE was no different to other countries in being the target of international calls to move quickly, to ready their prisons for what may be inevitable, including by releasing first and foremost those who should not be in prison in the first place. And of course, looking at the appropriate release of others, especially those that are at risk of serious complications if they are infected. While Bahrain, Egypt, Morocco, other countries have released prisoners in response to the pandemic, including some peaceful dissenters, but by no means all of them, the UAE has not. It had issued a pardon as part of its annual Ramadan pardons that included around 4,000 prisoners. None of them included those who are unjustly detained, including Ahmed Mansour or others in prison, and it did not include many of the people that are at serious risk, and that Human Rights Watch has documented the case of prisoners living with HIV who are at serious risk because they have not been receiving the adequate medical treatment that they deserve. And so these are some of the people that are at risk. Mid-March, we started hearing reports of the virus finally entering UAE prisons, including Al-Wathba, Al-Barsha Detention Center, the new detention center, and the Al Awir Dubai Central Jail. And so Human Rights Watch did a report on that. We spoke to many prisoners' family members about the conditions, about the deteriorating detention conditions, deteriorating access to healthcare, which was already not up to international standards. And the UAE has not acknowledged that there have been outbreaks in their prisons, especially in Al-Wathba, where we believe is most dire. They have not refuted any allegations. One main point that I want to stress here, and that I stress as often as possible in our work, is that the UAE has denied access to international human rights groups and UN experts to monitor and inspect independently their prisons. They have been dogged by claims of horrible detention conditions, of horrible treatment of prisoners, of torture, and all they've done in the past, let's say since 2015, when the last UN expert was allowed access to the UAE, is just a refuting of the allegations superficially, without really presenting any evidence. And really the only way that they can refute these allegations is by allowing people to enter, to meet privately with prisoners, to speak to them, and to monitor the conditions on a regular basis. And that has not happened. Surprisingly, even though the UAE presents itself as an open, progressive, tolerant country, but clearly they have something to hide, because an open country would allow access to international human rights groups, to researchers, to obviously UN experts, and that hasn't been the case. And I think that's the number one demand that we have for the UAE, is to allow access to their prisons. Of course, we have called on them and have recommendations for all countries around the world in terms of how to protect from the pandemic and how to protect the prisoners that they are responsible for from that, obviously including reducing prison populations, but also allowing for a higher sanitation standards. We've heard from families that prisoners are not getting hand sanitizers or masks or soap, or not enough, or not frequently enough. People who have chronic conditions are suffering as a result of lower access to what was already not the best healthcare facilities in these prisons. And so that's where we're at now. We have not heard from the UAE about what is going on in their prisons, and do not know what kind of measures they're taking to make sure that their prisoners are protected. They have not released and do not seem to be willing to release any peaceful dissenters who should be amongst the first to be released in these times, but also should not have had to spend a day in prison anyways. And yeah, I'll stop it there.
Thank you, Heba. Thanks for your participation. And now finally we have the speech of David Hay, CEO of Detained International and member in the Association of Victims of Torture in United Arab Emirates, to talk about unfair trials. You're welcome, Mr. David.
Hi, good afternoon. Firstly, thank you to all my fellow panelists for what has been, I think, a very important discussion, and thank you to the Gulf Institute for Democracy and Human Rights for organising it. I'm going to talk briefly about fair trials in the UAE, or rather the complete absence of them, especially as it relates to Emirati prisoners of conscience, but also as it relates to expats, as I believe, as I will set out going forward, that's through the publicity of expat unfair trials that we may be able to bring change to the treatment of Emirati prisoners of conscience. I speak to you today from personal experience of unfair trials in the UAE, having spent 22 months of my life subjected to them, where I was set up and held in arbitrary detention for 15 months for so-called breach of trust, and a further 5 months for so-called Twitter abuse. During that detention, I met many Emirati prisoners. I also speak from my experience of helping others suffering injustice and abuse in the UAE, whether they be Emirati prisoners of conscience, expats, or the Dubai ruler's daughter, Princess Latifa. To start, though, I wanted to have a quick look at what are fair trials. And if we look at Article 10, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it clearly states that everyone is entitled in full equality to a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial tribunal. Article 11 goes on to state that everyone has the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, according to law, in a public trial at which he has had all the guarantees necessary for his defence. Now, what evidence is there that the UAE does not have fair trials? Well, I'm sure the esteemed organisations of the panel all concur on this point. So to take some evidence from bodies that are not here today, in 2019, the Freedom House report concluded that the UAE judiciary is not independent, with court rulings subject to review by the political leadership, judges being appointed by executive decree, and the judiciary is an institution managed by those executive officials. They found that many judges are foreigners working on short-term contracts. They found that detainees are often detained without adequate access to legal counsel during interrogations, if any access, with lengthy detentions without charge not being uncommon. Judges are empowered to extend such detention indefinitely, and they discussed in detail the mass trial of UAE 94, which has been widely criticised for the systematic violations of international due process standards. In 2016, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture found credible evidence of torture in UAE custody. A recent US State Department country report found that all courts lacked full independence and there was no functional separation between the executive and judicial branches. If we move now to what the UK courts have found on UAE trials, a well-known extradition case in the name of Lodi set English High Court precedent when it held that there was a real risk of unfair trials in UAE courts and that English courts could not extradite British citizens to the UAE. A more recent 2017 Scottish extradition case found that a Scottish grandfather could not be extradited to the UAE, also on grounds of real risk of an unfair trial in the UAE. I'll come back to that case in a moment. In my own case, not only was I held in arbitrary detention and horrendous conditions, I was abused and tortured. When it came to the so-called trial, I would either not be taken to the court, often not allowed in the court if I was actually taken. If I was allowed in the court, I couldn't speak. There was certainly no translator in the so-called hearing, which would last minutes, and the prosecutor would be sitting right next to the judge. So if the UAE treats a high-profile expat in this way, the horrors meted out to Emirati prisoners of conscience are unthinkable. My experiences of UAE unfair trials and detention was detailed in the Scottish case I just mentioned. I'd like to share with you some of the important findings of that UK judge, a Sheriff T UAE trials and their detention system, because they're largely unreported. The case is known as the Lord Advocate for the Government of the United Arab Emirates versus Garnet Black. I provided evidence over 2 days for the defence, seeking to prevent the extradition of the Scottish grandfather. And I was cross-examined by UAE lawyers. The Scottish judge concluded that there was a real risk of unfair trials in the UAE, that high-ranking Emiratis have influence over and access to the police and judicial system and other aspects of civil society. He concluded in relation to my evidence that he had no doubt that I was telling the truth about seeing a civilian lawyer who acted for his former employers in Dubai police station, the company of a police officer pointing at him before being questioned and beaten by the police. The clear inference that the civilian lawyer had influence as to how he was badly treated and abused is irresistible, the judge said. He said that he fully accepted that I was repeatedly seriously assaulted by Dubai police officers and tasered while detained, that he accepts that I was interrogated and forced to sign a document in Arabic I didn't understand. He believed my account of squalid, overcrowded and insanitary detention conditions in Dubai police station, and further believed he was sexually assaulted and raped in the car park of that police station during his detention. And he was also satisfied that the evidence I gave about poor consular access and no consular protection while in custody is true. Those are very, very damning findings against the UAE judiciary and detention system. There are literally thousands of other cases that evidence the UAE's cowboy approach to justice and trials. A week doesn't pass in the UK when UAE courts hit the headlines for their abuse of someone. And perhaps it is this publicity of expat cases and fleeing Emirati princesses that will help bring change to the treatment of Emirati prisoners of conscience, as it is these cases that put the UAE system under the world's microscope. All of us here probably know all of this already. It won't come as a surprise to any of us that everyday Emirati prisoners of conscience, even Dubai's ruler's daughter, Sheikha Latifa Shamsa, his wife, Princess Haya, as well as expats, are all suffering from UAE's rough justice and human rights abuses. But what can we, the international community, do to bring a halt to unfair trials? There is, however, one thing I want to touch on briefly today, and that has gone somewhat under the radar in the UAE justice system. And I do so as I believe it offers the international community a route to apply pressure to seek change on abuse and detention of Emirati human rights defenders and to change unfair trials in the UAE. And I'm sure that's something we all want to see. Imagine I gave you the choice of being arrested in the UK or in the UAE. Which of those two countries would you be more confident to deal with your case fairly? I'm sure we would all here thinking that it would be the UK. But what if I now told you that you were in fact in custody in the UAE and your case was being heard by a judiciary in the UAE staffed by UK judges? That would probably make you feel okay because you would think that it would be fair. Unbeknown to many people in the world, Dubai and Abu Dhabi hire countless judges from the UK court, some of whom are even sitting both in the UK courts and the UAE courts at the same time. They do this to buy the UAE judiciary a respectability it does not warrant. It enables the UAE to launder its abuse of Emirati prisoners of conscience and its unjust legal system with the respectability of British justice. But it's tin pot justice. It just happens to be meted out by esteemed UK judges earning a bit of money for old rope in their retirement. As just some of the 20 current examples, Lord David Hope, Scotland's former top judge and ex-deputy president of the UK Supreme Court, is in charge of Abu Dhabi's commercial court. Another judge, Lord McGee, is also in Abu Dhabi's commercial court at the same time as sitting in the Court of Session in Edinburgh. Sir Jeremy Cook, the former head of the commercial court in England, sits in the DIFC Dubai's commercial court. This is the respectability the UAE is buying. UK judges on the payroll of the UAE, part of Emirati Ministries of Justice, working alongside judges administering UAE's arbitrary treatment and abuse of its people, who are uncomfortable to the regime, but playing by the UAE rules. The judge that jailed Ahmed Mansour is quite possibly, as we speak, sitting on a UAE Joint Judicial Committee with the former head of the English Commercial Court discussing UAE courts and trials. I highlight this now as this is one area where we, the international community, can apply pressure for change to call for the release of Emirati prisoners of conscience. The UAE judiciary may be accountable to no one, but their rulers. The UK judges that staff its court still can be held to account in the UK. It's time, I think, for the UK judges that sit in the UAE courts to either seek immediate investigation and change to the grave human rights abuses and use of unfair trials in the UAE judiciary in which they sit, or it's time and to call for the release of Emirati prisoners of conscience, or otherwise they must resign their well-paid Emirati judicial positions. To conclude, no one should be surprised that the UAE is a hotbed of unfair trials and human rights abuses. When you dine in the UAE, it's fair to say that you sup with the devil. The only surprise, I think, for all of us is that the devil's assistants are English judges. So that concludes what I would like to discuss on unfair trials. Thank you.
Thank you so much. In my name and the name of the Gulf Center, the Gulf Institute for Democracy and Human Rights, I thank you all for your valuable participation. And we hope that this conference will achieve its goals and thus stand and support all detainees in the Gulf prisons. I also thank all viewers and followers, and we will be with you at our last session tomorrow at the same time. Follow us. Thank you so much.